Hey everybody, I'm Marie Bard Curtis of the Quilted Poodle. In today's video, I'm going to show you how I load my quilt onto my long arm. I have a Jukey TL 2200 and I'm loading on a 12-foot frame. This is a picture of what my Jukey frame looks like. I have a 5-rail system. At the top I have the take-up rail, which I'm advancing my quilt on. And that rail, I've attached my longest leader, and with my leaders, I'm using the red snapper system so that I have actually sewn a channel at the end of my leader, and I insert the tube and then use the plastic snap that goes on top of it. And to me, that makes loading quite a bit faster. Below that, I have the idler rail, or the dead bar as it's sometimes called, and that just helps to guide your fabric as it's being taken up on the take-up rail. Next, I have the backing rail, sometimes called the belly bar because it's right in front of you. And on that rail, I have my shortest leader, and I attach my backing to that rail. Below that is my quilt top rail, and I have my second longest leader there. And more I'm using that quilt top rail to load my quilts, especially if they're the larger quilts. It seems to help keep my quilts straighter, and I have fewer problems with it shifting. If I'm just quilting a baby quilt or a lap quilt, then I will usually just float it and use my blue clamps to hold it in place. Below that, I have a batting rail. And I usually buy my batting by the roll, so I can load 3 rolls of batting on there, so it helps with storage. So I just pull it off as I need it, measure it, cut it, and then add it to my quilt sandwich. I started out with a 10-foot frame, and then I added 2 more feet to get to a 12-foot frame. I had to extend my red snappers. Well, I didn't want to buy a whole new set, so what I did is I went on Amazon and I found these things called Mondo Bag Clips. And what they are essentially is white snappers, white red snappers. They're quite a bit less expensive than the red snappers, but they're made of the same plastic. The Mondo Bag Clips are not quite as stiff as the red snappers, but they work equally as well. So I added a 2-foot piece of the tubing inside of the hem in my leader and put a dowel in between them and connected them together. So what I like to do is measure up my quilt top and my backing before I get started to be sure that I'm going to have enough material. So I'm going to move my quilt top over here, and here's my quilt backing. That's 112 by 112. So it doesn't really matter which way I load my backing onto my long arm. I'm going to have plenty. Before I put my fabrics on the long arm, I do like to make a cursory check to be sure that my fabrics are square. So I'll take my quilt top. I'm going to fold it in half along the length. Then I'll take the 2 corners, try to match them together, and the same thing with the other end of the quilt. And then I'm going to drape this across my long arm. I'm going to use some magnets to hold it on just so it doesn't slide off. And these magnets can be purchased at Harbor Freight, and then I just added some knobs on them so that they're easy to pull up. So I'm just draping my quilt top over my frame, using the magnet to hold it up so it doesn't fall apart. And if my fabric is square, when I lay it on there and it drapes, it will fold nicely at the end. So this is fairly square. Now, if it weren't, it won't drape or fold as nicely. It almost creates a bias. So as you can see, it doesn't exactly hang straight at the fold anymore. You get a bit of pulling across your quilt, which lets you know that your quilt probably isn't square. So I'm fairly confident that my quilt top is square. And you can do the same thing with the backing. What I like to do, because I don't have to worry about which way my backing needs to be turned in order to best utilize the amount of fabric that I have, I'm going to load it so that the salvages are connected to the leaders. And I do that because I know that the salvages should be straight, so I don't really have to square up my quilt other than be sure that the middle of the quilt connects to the middle of the take-up leader, and the middle of the backing connects to the middle of the belly bar roller. And then I'm going to mark it with a straight pin at the top of the backing. And I'm also going to put a pin at the center point at the bottom edge, salvage edge of the backing. And because this is a batik, it doesn't really have a right or wrong side. So if it was just regular fabric, I would want to make sure that the most brilliant side is on the bottom, because that's going to be the outside of my quilt. And then I'm just going to drape this over the rails of my long arm. I'm going to drape it over the take-up rail. And I will have my salvage edge down along the bottom that I will attach to my leader. Now I just have the edge of the backing cross over on the leader, and then I'll find the center and pin it to my leader. So locating the center of the leader and the pin that I put in the backing, I'm just going to very slightly drape my fabric and then put a clip. And I kind of pay attention to how much fabric I have sticking out on the other end of that clip. And now I'm going to come back with some of my longer pieces of red snapper or bag clips, and I'll remove the short pieces of clips as I move along with my longer pieces. So I'll just use the heel of my hand on the top of my rail. When I get to one of the smaller pieces, I'll just remove it. Again, using the heel of my hand to push it down on the tubing. And as I said, the Mondo bag clips work just like the red snappers. Now I'll take a piece of the clip from the red snapper package. So obviously I use these interchangeably. And you don't have to be gentle with these red snappers. I just bend them up. When I first got my red snappers, I actually soaked them in the bathtub in warm water to make them a little more pliable. And then I just used some scrap fabric and draped it across the tubing and then put the plastic covering over it. And that kind of stretched them out, made them a little easier to use. So as I'm going along here, I'm just pressing down. So now I'm going to go to the back and I'm going to evenly drape my fabric and then connect it. So I'm just going to pull my quilt backing over the rails because I'll want to begin rolling it up on my belly bar until I get just enough fabric left so that I can connect it to the take-up rail. And I like to drape it over the take-up rail because it gives a little bit of tension to the fabric to help keep it straight. Now I'm going to begin rolling my backing onto the belly bar. And that little bit of tension that you get by draping your fabric over the take-up rail tends to help it stay straight, slightly taut. And as I'm rolling this on, I am looking to be sure that my backing is rolling evenly so that I'm not getting my fabric pulling away from here. And I'll go along and smooth my fabric. I always end up pushing it out to the sides from the middle as I'm rolling along. But it does help keep your fabric nice and taut and nice and straight. Now I do know my ends were not cut completely straight, but I don't really worry about that because I'm using the selvage ends to connect to the leaders, so I know that that part is straight. All right, I'm getting pretty close. Okay, now I know for my backing, I need to go underneath my dead bar. Now I'm looking for the pin that I placed in the middle of my backing. I'm just going to put the pin there to hold it. Then I'll get some of my little clips, and these will hold it in place temporarily. I like to get that tubing right up on the top, because again, I'm going to use the palm of my hand to press down. All right, I'll put a few in. I'll go in one direction from the center and then off in the other direction. And then the last part right here. Then I can go along and place the long pieces of clips. Again, pressing down with the palm of my hand. Now we can snug this up a little bit, and then we'll be ready to load the top. Now it's time to load my quilt top onto my frame, and I'm going to use the quilt top rail to load my quilt on. I'm going to connect my quilt to my leaders, and I'm going to use my red snappers. If I were quilting a smaller project like a baby quilt or a lap quilt, I might float my quilt instead, in which case I would have my batting loaded on top of my quilt back and then lay my quilt top on top of that, and then use my blue clips to sort of stabilize my quilt top in place. I've placed pins at the center of the top and the bottom of my quilt. The reason for the pin is I can use that to connect to the center of my leader. I could use that as a reference point. But because this quilt is so much smaller than my backing, I'm actually going to move it over towards the right. That way I'll have material left and I can use it for another project. So I'm just going to drape my fabric over the frame I'll probably have this about 4 inches or so away from the side of my backing. Now I'm ready to attach my quilt top to my leader. So I've pulled my quilt top up onto the belly bar, and then I'll pull my top leader up. And I just want to have enough fabric to cover the tubing that's inside of my leader. I'll attach one of the small clips, and I'll attach one in the middle, and one on the end. And the smaller clips essentially base the quilt in place until you can add the large clips. I have a second zero centering tape that I like to pull across, and it just helps me keep track of the number that I see on this tape with the number that I see on my dead bar tape. And it lets me know again that my quilt is straight. Now I'm going to attach the full red snapper. And I left the little one there on the end, no need to remove that. I'll pull up the one in the middle and then attach the last red snapper. And sometimes you need the pressure of your hold hand, sometimes just a thumb. Then I can begin rolling my quilt top, and I usually roll in this direction. I'm going to pull some of this off, make it a little bit easier. As I roll, I'm watching to see that my quilt is straight. No wrinkles. All right, now I can just pull my top down because I still have to add my batting. Now I've already measured and cut my batting, and I've put it in my sling, and then I'll just have to pull it up. All right, that looks pretty straight. And now what I'm going to do is run a straight line of stitching across my batting, and that's going to be the reference point to pull my quilt top up to in order to keep it straight. I'm going to use my channel lock to create that straight line. I've engaged my horizontal channel lock, so my machine will run horizontally and stitch a straight line across my quilt. I'm going to needle down, needle up, pull away, and pull up my bobbin thread. And then I'm going to go back. I'll turn my machine on, and I'll create my straight stitching line. Okay, when I stop, and I used a stitch that was 6 stitches per inch. Pull away, go back to the original spot, needle down, needle up, pull away. I've pulled away all of my thread, and now I'm going to cut. Cut close to the quilt. I pulled up my bobbin thread and I've trimmed it away. Now I'm going to use that straight line of stitching to show me where to put my quilt top. I'll roll off a little bit of my quilt top. Now when I put my quilt top up, I'm going to put it under my measuring tape. And again, the purpose of having the second 0 measuring tape is so that I can look at the number here and look at the number up here and know that I've got my quilt centered. And I'm just taking my quilt top and putting it up against that straight line of stitching. And in fact, I can still use my horizontal channel lock if I move my quilt 1/8 of an inch beyond that straight stitch. And I don't want to have too much tension on my quilt as I'm stitching it along, because I don't want it to pull. With my channel lock engaged, I'm going to stitch from the center to the right, from the center to the left, and that will stabilize my quilt in place. I'm going to move to the middle of my quilt. Make sure my quilt is pulled up. So I'm really careful when I do this because your quilt will tend to want to pull back towards you. So I'll use my fingers and kind of walk it along. Needle down, needle up, pull away, pull up my bobbin thread, and now I'll begin stitching. I could use the basting stitch, but I'm just going to use my 6 stitches per inch. Okay, pull away, go back, needle down, needle up, and pull my threads. And I'll cut away any extra threads that I have. Now I'm going to go to the center of my quilt and stitch off to the left. Needle down, needle up. Okay, pull up my bobbin thread, and then I'll begin stitching again. Okay, and then I can baste down my left side as soon as I turn my channel lock off, and then I'll go over and baste down on the right side. Okay, I've disengaged my channel lock, so I can now stitch down the left side. And I'm going to stitch about 1/8 of an inch. Needle down, needle up, move away, and cut your threads close to your quilt. Now I'm going to go over to the right side and baste that. I'm going to start my basting at the front and go towards the top of my quilt. That way I'm not constantly pushing fabric downward. So, needle down, needle up, pull away, pull your bobbin thread, and stitch. I have to admit, as not being so great at sewing backwards. But by the time I get to the end of my quilt, I'll be much better and much straighter. But all these stitches are going to be lost in the binding anyway. Pull away, go back, needle down, needle up, pull your threads, and you'll have 3 threads in your hand. Just cut them all close to your quilt top. I'm trimming any extra threads. All right, now all I have to do is load my pattern and I'll be ready to quilt. I hope this video has helped some of you with loading your quilt. Mine is not the only method to use to load. It works for me, and sometimes I change it up as I go from one quilt to another. But find the method that's going to work for you. Hope you enjoyed the video. God bless.